Well, good morning, everyone. It is indeed great to see so many people here again in person as well as online. I think in the best possible way, it feels a little bit like a reunion. So delighted to be here and delighted to be able to share with you highlights of the report that we've launched today, which, as Miles just mentioned, is our annual statistical guide to the many ways in which the UK-based financial and related professional services makes a direct and indirect contribution to the economy. Now, this report is the one that's perhaps most closely identified with the City UK, and it's the source of some of our kind of best known, best loved statistics, including some that you've already heard this morning. But because some of the content is actually quite familiar, I thought it would be worth starting with a reminder of why the findings of this report are so important. And so, these are some examples of headlines, in major news media just from the past week. And public debate is dominated by issues of low growth and high and rising inflation. So I'm not going to dwell on the macro outlook, but I think it is worth looking at this in just a little bit of detail before we come on to the role of our industry in improving things and helping this situation. So this chart shows the expectation of official forecasters for UK GDP growth over the next several years. And you can see that after the 7% growth registered last year, which followed on from the 9% contraction in the kind of key pandemic year of 2020, growth is again expected to slow quite significantly this year to around 4%, but then, kind of worryingly, it's expected to almost grind to a halt in the subsequent 3 years. And I think that there are two main points to emphasize with this. The first is that, unfortunately, the idea that a lot of us were talking about just a few months ago of, a post-COVID economic boom is now looking like kind of wishful thinking. And second, that the good news is that I think we are facing a lot less uncertainty than we were 6 months or 12 or even 18 months ago. But unfortunately, risks to the outlook remain very high, and they are almost exclusively on the downside. So, for example, the IMF's latest World Economic Outlook lists no fewer than 8 separate downside risks to the global economic outlook, and they range from debt distress to a worsening of the geopolitical environment. And it also notes that many of these risks are interconnected. So far, so kind of gloomy, but what does financial and related professional services have to do with all of this and to the rest of our day's discussions here? So this chart shows you that the industry has exhibited relative stability throughout the pandemic period. So these are not growth rates. This is the contribution to overall GVA growth that different sectors made. And you can see that financial services in particular experienced much less of a swing in the contraction of 2020 and then the recovery of 2021 than other industries did. And, in that sense, I guess maybe just to continue the nautical theme that we've heard earlier this morning, in that sense, you could almost say that financial services served a little bit like the ballast in stabilizing a ship. We've also heard already this morning about structural challenges for the UK, and indeed one of the biggest structural issues facing the economy is the low rate of productivity growth. So this is a huge topic, and we'd need a whole session just on productivity to do it justice, but very briefly, here on the left, you can see that productivity growth has fallen across the G7 since the 2008-9 financial crisis, but the fall was particularly steep in the UK. However, there are a few bright spots amidst the gloom of UK productivity data, and one of them is indeed financial and related professional services. So what you see on the right is that productivity in financial services has consistently been above that of the economy as a whole. And although the industry's productivity growth has been weaker in recent years than it was before the financial crisis, you can see that over the past 2 decades, its productivity growth rate has been almost double that of the economy as a whole, at around 5.5% compared to 3.1%. And here you can see that in 2020, which is the latest year for which we have annual data, financial services was the UK's fourth most productive sector. So these points are all in our new research, but also obviously, I couldn't stand here and go through this presentation without sharing some of those very familiar points that we all know and love. We have heard about employment already, but this graph shows you the spread of financial and related professional services across the UK. And I want to also take this opportunity to flag that at the moment we're also working on our annual research highlighting the contribution of the industry to regional economies, which we're going to launch in September. And so I definitely hope to see many of you again then when we publish that research. Another aspect of the industry's direct economic contribution is through the external sector, so basically trade and investment. So here on the left, you can see that over the last 4 years, again, that was as much data as was available, financial services was the largest recipient of inward FDI, and the wider professional services category that includes our related professional services of consulting, accounting, and legal services, that was also a significant recipient. And then the chart on the right is about trade. What you see there is all of the sectors that individually generated trade surpluses, and all of them are actually service sectors, except for what we've done in the last bar at the bottom, which is where we've basically aggregated all of the goods sectors that generate surpluses, and there aren't very many of them because, of course, I'm sure everybody knows that the UK runs a structural merchandise trade deficit. What you can see is that financial services runs the largest trade surplus by far. And again, the ONS includes what we call related professional services in that wider category of other business services. And you can see that that wider category runs the second largest surplus. And so basically what that means is that overall, the financial and related professional services industry plays a really crucial role in partially offsetting the deficits that are generated by other sectors, and thus helping to stabilize the balance of payments position. And I would add, actually, that in an environment where sterling is depreciating and slowing global growth may hamper UK exports in the months and years to come, that stabilization factor, I think, becomes all the more important in helping to mitigate any pressure on the current account. I haven't yet mentioned the biggest macroeconomic indicator of all, which is, of course, GVA. I don't want this to be death by numbers, and so suffice to say that financial and related professional services is one of the UK's largest industries in terms of economic contribution. And coming back to the point I made earlier about how the industry's contribution was relatively stable throughout the wild economic swings that we've seen in the past couple of years, it's because a lot of the products and services it provides, I think, are fairly fundamental. I mean, of course, some of them are discretionary, but the ecosystem really provides a foundation that allows the rest of the economy to function. And so in my penultimate slide here, I wanted to share just a couple of examples from our research about the industry's role as a facilitator. So here you see mortgage lending, which had grown steadily until the onset of the pandemic and then recovered again last year following the fall in 2020. And you also see equity issuance values, which is obviously one of the key ways in which companies raise funds. So in short, this is just really a snapshot of the way the industry directly helps businesses and consumers. I hope that you will take a moment to look at the full report to get a sense of some of the other indicators. But just before I wrap up, I wanted to go back to the question about why is all of this so important? And I'll leave you with 2 points that I think start to answer that question. First, I would say the industry is important because it does play a stabilizing and enabling role in the economy, which is always fundamentally important, but it's perhaps even more so at a time of increasing economic distress. And second, this research is important because it provides specific examples and metrics of the value of an industry that I think is actually still too often either misunderstood or maligned or possibly potentially both. And of course, an important part of that is quantifying that value, because that makes clear the huge scale of the offering. But I think it's also important to recognize that the qualitative message is as important as the big numbers. And that's in part because not all of the value can be quantified. And so with that thought, I wanted to conclude by leaving you with one economist's summary of what a financial system provides. So Robert Merton was, of course, a joint Nobel Prize winner in economics, along with Myron Scholes, a name I'm sure is familiar to many in the room, he of the Black-Scholes model fame. And this is from a paper that he published nearly 30 years ago, but I wanted to use it to close my remarks because I think it offers a way to consider the key facts in our report from a wider perspective. If you think about, just to take one example here, pooling funds. So, an example of the principle is syndicated loans. So a very current example that I can give you, drawing on economic research that we actually just published a few months ago, is in terms of green finance. So not debt finance as a whole, but in terms of lending, almost all green and sustainable lending to date has occurred through syndicated loans, and that's of course because syndicated lending allows larger projects that might not otherwise have been able to be financed to be financed. It also deals with the issue of risk, where risk is perceived to be relatively high. So that's just one example to close on. Hopefully that has given you some food for thought as well as some key statistics. So with that, once again, let me just invite you to take a look at our new research in more detail, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions about it or to discuss it further over the coffee or the lunch. So thank you very much.